Hi, so this is the last lecture on season three, and we've been talking throughout this season about the importance of connection and the ways in which your connections to other people help anchor you as a self and help enable you to build a self that takes responsibility for itself. Um, and we've been looking at different kinds of connections, but we haven't really focused directly on the question of connection. What is it to really be connected to another person in the way that helps build out the self rather than in a dysfunctional way or in a shallow way or a connection based on misunderstanding and fantasy? What kinds of connections to other people really help embed us in norms and commitments that enrich ourselves rather than undermining ourselves? And to which connections are we actually responsible, right? How do other people make real claims on us that we need to be responsive to? We saw this come up in Fish Out of Water. We saw the basis of Bojack's connection with the baby seahorse be very local and born out of shared need, but it seemed to be a real connection, but it was a funny kind of temporary connection. And we see different kinds of explorations of connection throughout this season. Because it's Bojack Horseman, unsurprisingly, a lot of the connections we see explored are failed connections. They're really explorations of how connections can be not what they seem or not really sustainable or not really functional. But we do get some moments that give us clues about what a real connection of the right sort to sustain agency and selfhood might look like. So one thing we do see throughout the season is a series of interesting connections that are to some extent real and to some extent based on a fantasy or a misunderstanding. I think this theme is going to be much more central in season four, and we're going to talk about it much more there, the role of fantasy in relationships. But what we see here is a bunch of misunderstandings and fantasies that undermine connection, but not completely, which is interesting. They make connections partial. So to give you a few examples, we have the episode where Diane gets invited to a party, but it's the wrong Diane, right? It's based on a mistaken identity. And yet she actually does seem to have some kind of surprising temporary but real connection with the hosts, even though it's based on a misunderstanding. And when she gets back from that party and she's really, really high, she has one of her most real moments of connection with Mr. Peanut Butter. And she tells him that she loves him. And she says right then and there that she's worried that this is a very temporary kind of connection induced by the hallucinatory drugs and that she's not going to be able to sustain it in the morning, which is interesting because she seems to be claiming that the connection she has with him is more real when it's enabled by the drugs, which are hallucinogens, than the kind of connection that she has that's clouded by her own neuroses when she's not high. Another example, Princess Carolyn seems to have this great connection to Rutabaga, her rabbit colleague, right? She has great rapport with him and she collaborates really well with him, and they enjoy each other's company, and they seem to be starting to fall in love. But in fact, he turns out to be a slime ball. He turns out not to be connected to her in anything like the way that he pretended to be, and he turns out to be very insulting of what sort of connection they have. And after that, she says that she finds most dates pointless. She acknowledges, and this is a theme for her throughout the whole show, all of the seasons, that connection for her is hard. She's, in particular, a character who keeps ending up with fake connections based on fantasy and misunderstanding. Mr. Peanut Butter is in some sense very connected to his family. He feels very close to them, but importantly, his entire relationship with them is based on sort of joshing around and joking around, and if they try to talk about anything real, they freak out. So that's a connection that is real in some ways, but seriously compromised in other ways, right? They're incapable of having a serious conversation. That's, I think, a familiar kind of family to many of us. And then there's Bojack and Anna Spanakopita, who we've already talked about, where she tells him explicitly that she doesn't want a connection based on reality. She doesn't want to be known for who she really is, and she doesn't want to know Bojack for who he really is. She prefers to have a connection based on fantasy and a sort of a shallow, fantastical picture of who the other person is. And at first, Bojack agrees with her that this is a better idea, but then later he changes his mind and tries to forge a real connection to her, which works temporarily and then falls apart. Interestingly, I think that one of the most intense moments of connection that we see throughout this season is the moment of Bojack connecting with himself in the mirror in the advertisement for Secretariat. And this is a moment that is both very real. You take it that he's really moved by the connection with the version of himself that he sees, but it's also multiply fanciful and not based on reality. And most obviously, it's a connection with himself, not with somebody else. So in that sense, it's kind of a degenerate example of a connection. Secondly, it's a connection to himself as Secretariat, so as playing a fictional role. So it's explicitly based on a fictionalized fantasy version of him. This is especially doubly true given that we all know that even though the whole world is celebrating him playing Secretariat, he didn't really play Secretariat, right? It was a fantasy computer version of him that played Secretariat. So his felt relationship to that role isn't even based on reality. And then I think this is kind of visually cool and interesting. He says that he particularly likes seeing himself as Secretariat in the mirror as opposed to in the movie, because in the movie his image isn't reversed, but in the mirror his image is reversed. It's the opposite of how he really looks, and that feels more right to him because after all, he usually sees himself in the mirror. Which is interesting also because unlike most of us, he sees himself on TV and in movies a lot too. So he does see the non-reversed version of himself fairly often. But it seems like the intimate version that he sees at home in his bathroom mirror is the version that he feels is most directly him. So there's this set of displacements here, right? He's connected to himself, which is already weird, but he's connected to himself because he feels like he's seeing the real self, but the real self is multiply displaced. It's a reversed image, it's in a mirror, it's as playing a fictional role that isn't really him, and as playing a fictional role that he didn't really play. So it's a very displaced connection. So an interesting question is, what is it that he's feeling, and is there anything authentic underneath all of that? There's a kind of a similar moment to this, which I found really sad. I'm not sure if you did too, where Jonah, Princess Carolyn's assistant, who is in many ways great, but consistently has trouble with emotional connection to other people, and the show makes that clear. We'll return to that when we talk about season 4. He writes his own appreciation card, right? So he also forges connection with Princess Carolyn based on a fantasy or an illusion by giving her these words that he actually wrote himself and trying to sustain connection with her artificially in this way. One of the most explicit discussions of connection that we get in season 3 is quite different from these other cases, right? It's the time where Bojack crashes a wedding at a fancy Oscar party that he's at. And he grabs the mic. He doesn't know the two people who are getting married. And he says, he gives a speech about how they're so right for each other, which is itself based on fantasy since he's never met them and he has no idea. But one of the things he says to congratulate them on getting married is, when you know, you know. You know, when you find the right person, you know. And of course he says this based on nothing, but at that moment one of the brides realizes that she isn't in fact sure that she knows, right? She doesn't have complete confidence that this partner is certainly the person for her. And in particular, she worries that the person isn't necessarily one who completes her, right? And so she temporarily calls off the wedding. She says, I don't know if my girlfriend is actually the one true correct person for me, and I don't know if she completes me, and so I don't know if I'm really connected to her in the right way to get married. And Bojack has one of his moments where he really steps up and does well, and he talks her back into it, saying that there is no such thing as that kind of certainty in any connection, and there is no such thing as being completed by another person. And this is the closest I think we get in season 3 to an actual theory of what sort of connection with another person we are and aren't looking for, what sort of connection with another person sustains our identity. So he says, no one completes you. That's not a thing. If you're lucky to find someone you can halfway tolerate, you sink your nails in and you don't let go no matter what. Otherwise, you just get older and harder and more alone. And you do anything you can to fill that hole with friends and your career and meaningless sex, but the hole doesn't get filled. It's the loneliest feeling in the world. So I think that there's a positive point and a negative point here, right? The negative point is when you come up with a theory of real human connection, make sure that it's not a romantic fantasy theory where real connection requires that the other person completes you and makes you whole and fixes you, or a romantic theory that you could have some sort of transparent certainty that this person will do that for you. And that's the wrong image of connection. Other people don't complete us, and they don't fix us, and they don't make us whole. But that doesn't mean that connection isn't real and connection isn't important, right? It's real, but it's not magical, and it's not some sort of romantic ideal. So what is it? Well, we don't get a full positive picture here, but what we get from this scene, and I think from the rest of the season, and I talked about this at the end of the last lecture a little bit, is a picture of real connection as a connection to another person where they really do get to make moral claims on you, and you really do get to make moral claims on them. And there's also room for forgiveness. You get to fail and hold yourself accountable for your failure, and then rebuild the relationship if it's real. And why do these kinds of connections complete you? Because I shouldn't say they don't complete you. Why do these kind of connections help sustain identity? Well, because as we saw, if you're really completely alone and nothing is making a claim on you, then you don't have anything that anchors who you are and gives you commitments and helps shape your path forward. And you end up alone, not just in the sense that there aren't people around you, but in the sense that you're unmoored as a self. Again, I described this before as an anti-Sartrean argument. And then at almost the end of the season, we get the deepest explorations of connection. We get two in episode 9 and in episode 11. Episode 9, the best thing that ever happened, is the episode where Bojack, in effect, breaks up with Princess Caroline. Even though they're not romantically involved at that point, he's breaking up with her. He's breaking up their work relationship, but it very much feels like a breakup. And the other is episode 11, That's Too Much Man, which is, I think, one of the hardest episodes to watch of the whole series. And this is the episode with the apology bender that we talked about before, but it also ends with Sarah Lynn's death. A very difficult episode to watch. So episode 9, why is it so interesting? Well, it's not about connection really so much as separation, right? But the two are sides of the same coin. And I don't know what you guys thought, but I think that this episode is just absolutely brilliant as a literary work and a visual artwork at capturing the rhythm, well, an audiovisual artwork, I should say, at capturing the rhythm of a breakup. I'm not sure how to put it more precisely than that, right? But for any of you who have gone through a breakup that requires a long, extended conversation and a negotiation of how to create space. They're not a couple, but this is one of the best, they're not a romantic couple, but this is one of the best artistic renderings I've seen of that peculiar rhythm, right? It's an exploration of how we create distance when we need to, how we forge not connection with another person, but a lessening of connection or an ending of connection or some space between us. I love the complexity of it. I love the way it goes through stages such as, acceptance and pleading and anger and recrimination and sadness, and then on and off, a kind of the connection comes back in sort of by habit, right? They're used to being connected to each other. They're used to helping each other and supporting one another. So even though they're separating, that connection keeps on kicking in by habit. And Princess Carolyn thinks that when it reemerges like that, that means that maybe the separation isn't happening, but it in fact is. And I think that's um, a familiar dynamic from breakups. So in this breakup episode, this exploration of how connection ends or is intentionally weakened, at least, I think we can learn a lot of lessons about what connection is, right, through its end. Moving on to episode 11, the Sarah Lynn episode, we already talked about the apology binge part of it, so I want to focus on the end. I want to focus on Sarah Lynn's death, right? Bojack is closer with Sarah Lynn in this episode, at least from his internal point of view. He's closer to her than he almost ever is with anyone, and he tells her that, right? He considers her family, and he considers them as having a special bond. So he's definitely feeling that they're deeply connected. And in a way they are, but in the middle of all his felt closeness, which he's experiencing on the inside, the connection is not as real as it seems because he's not listening and he's not paying attention to what she's actually telling him and what she actually needs. He feels like their connection is reciprocal, but in a lot of ways it's very one way, right? So she tells him again and again how her whole life is not the life that she actually wants, and that no one will listen and no one will acknowledge that. Most poignantly, she tells him that she still always wanted to be an architect. This is a thing that we saw her say when she was a very little girl, and she was immediately dismissed, right? Her mother dismissed her and Bojack dismissed her, and nobody listened. They just treated it as a silly thing that a little kid said. And what we find out now is that it wasn't a silly thing that a little kid said. It's been a lifelong fantasy of hers that has stuck with her through all these years and all of her stardom. And she says it to Bojack again, and he still doesn't really listen and hear it. He doesn't hear what she's saying, which is actually, this whole life is wrong. This life where I'm a pawn of my celebrity is not the life I wanted. I wanted to actually build things and create things and have this, and I had this specific, substantial other love. And she wants to go to the planetarium, not because she loves stars, but because she loves the building, right? So her passion for architecture is not just a silly fantasy. It's real. It's something that defines her, but nobody listens. And she wins the Oscar and she's not there, and she realizes that her life is completely out of control, that she has no idea what she's doing with her life. And he's still not listening. He's still not seeing her and not seeing the help that she's actually asking for or the moral support that she's seeking. Instead, he just feels like they're hanging out and being close and having a great time together. And the ultimate irony here, I think irony is the right word. I'm not sure if I want to back away from that word, but the ultimate irony here is the very end of the episode, right? He gives her this big speech about how close they are and how meaningful their relationship is and how connected they are. And then we find out that during that speech, she was already dead. There was no one there at all. So he was so wrapped up in his own internal feelings of closeness to her that he didn't notice that there literally wasn't another person there, right? He was paying so little attention to her. He didn't see that she was already gone. It's a very, very moving scene, right? And it comes back to this theme that we're seeing throughout the entire course and the entire series, which is what's going on the inside isn't what makes things real. He may feel all that closeness on the inside. He may intend to be a good friend to her. He might have nice, warm, fuzzy feelings of closeness and friendship. But if they're not enacted in the real world, they're not real. And that connection is only real if, as I've talked about, it goes both ways, right? If you can make claims on another person and they can make claims on you, and you can recognize one another and be genuinely bound up in each other's lives. He's not genuinely bound up in her life. He feels like he is because he has a long history with her, and being around her makes him feel connected. But he's not actually responsive to the life that she's really having. Furthermore, there's a very real sense in which he rightly feels like he's responsible for her death, right? It's not just that he wasn't really connected to her, but because he wasn't connected to her properly and he thought he was, he let her die. He didn't see what she was actually needing, and he didn't see the extent to which he was enabling her drug use in a way that was going to be fatal, that wasn't fun at all, and it wasn't even just about being addicted. It was a life or death matter. And he didn't see it because he was so absorbed in his own feelings that he wasn't paying attention, right? So this is the great tragedy of this episode. It's a double tragedy. On the one hand, the tragedy is he was so absorbed in his own feelings that he didn't see what she needed. But the other side of that tragedy is that his own feelings were specifically feelings of connection and friendship. So it's especially ironic that those were the feelings that he was absorbed in, given that that's the exact opposite of what was going on. And so the season ends with this ultimate question of, what is Bojack responsible for, right? More specifically, when are we responsible for what other people do? So we've been talking a ton about when you're responsible and how you're responsible for your own acts. But now we have this other question. When are you responsible for other people's acts? Season 2 ended this way also, right? It ended with him trying to figure out how responsible he was for Penny coming on to him and trying to get entangled with him. And he feels like even though she's the one who reached out, he's responsible for enabling that and letting it happen through his inappropriate use of power dynamics. And he's right? It's complicated how he's responsible, but he clearly is. And here too, Sarah Lynn is the one who took the overdose, and Sarah Lynn is the one who most immediately caused her own death. Bojack didn't literally kill her, but he feels that he's responsible for letting it happen. And so here too, there's a question about how he could be responsible for somebody else's actions by enabling them and by not appropriately managing that power dynamic. Because he has an inappropriate power dynamic with her too, right? She's like a daughter figure to him as well. So, in the context of a season that has very much been about what does it mean to take responsibility for yourself and not pin responsibility for your actions on anyone else, we now get the flip side of that, which is even if everyone should take responsibility for themselves, there's also another deep truth that sometimes we are responsible in a complicated way for what other people choose and for what other people do, especially when we owe them connection of a kind. Right? It's not clear exactly what role Bojack plays morally in her death, but it does seem that he morally failed her in a very important sense. So the death itself, I think, shows that their connection was not what he thought that it was, and the death itself constitutes a failure of his ability to be connected to her in the right way, and hence to take responsibility for her in the right way. All right, on that sad note, we will end our discussion of season 3, and I warn you, season 4 is more emotionally intense yet, so get ready. All right.